William Sidney Porter lends the pen name O. Henry to surprise endings, signed officially as Sidney Porter. His biography shows where he found inspiration for his characters. Their voices and his language were products of his era. Let's look at the story. A municipal report. The cities are full of pride, challenging each to each. This from her mountainside, that from her burthened beach. R. Kipling. Fancy a novel about Chicago or Buffalo, let us say, or Nashville, Tennessee. There are just 3 big cities in the United States that are story cities: New York, of course, New Orleans, and, best of the lot, San Francisco. Frank Norris. East is East, and West is San Francisco, according to Californians. Californians are a race of people. They are not merely inhabitants of a state. They are the Southerners of the West. Now, Chicagoans are no less loyal to their city, but when you ask them why, they stammer and speak of Lake Fish and the new Oddfellows building. But Californians go into detail. Of course they have, in the climate, an argument that is good for half an hour while you are thinking of your coal bills and heavy underwear. But as soon as they come to mistake your silence for conviction, madness comes upon them, and they picture the city of the Golden Gate as the Baghdad of the New World. So far, as a matter of opinion, no refutation is necessary. But, dear cousins all, from Adam and Eve descended, it is a rash one who will lay his finger on the map and say, in this town there can be no romance. What could happen here? Yes, it is a bold and a rash deed to challenge in one sentence history, romance, and Rand and McNally. Nashville, a city, port of delivery, and the capital of the state of Tennessee, is on the Cumberland River and on the N.C. and Street L and the L and N railroads. This city is regarded as the most important educational center in the South. I stepped off the train at 8 p.m. having searched the thesaurus in vain for adjectives. I must, as a substitution, meet a comparison in the form of a recipe. Take a London fog, 30 parts, malaria 10 parts, gas leaks 20 parts, dewdrops gathered in a brickyard at sunrise, 25 parts, odor of honeysuckle 15 parts. Mix. The mixture will give you an approximate conception of a Nashville drizzle. It is not so fragrant as a mothball nor as thick as pea soup, but 'tis enough, 'twill serve. I went to a hotel in a tumbril. It required strong self-suppression for me to keep from climbing to the top of it and giving an imitation of Sidney Carton. The vehicle was drawn by beasts of a bygone era and driven by something dark and emancipated. I was sleepy and tired, so when I got to the hotel I hurriedly paid it the 50 cents it demanded, with approximate lagniappe, I assure you. I knew its habits, and I did not want to hear it prat about its old master or anything that happened before the war. The hotel was one of the kind described as renovated. That means $20,000 worth of new marble pillars, tiling, electric lights and brass cuspidors in the lobby, and a new L&N timetable and a lithograph of Lookout Mountain in each one of the great rooms above. The management was without reproach, the attention full of exquisite southern courtesy, the service as slow as the progress of a snail and as good-humored as Rip Van Winkle. The food was worth traveling 1,000 miles for. There is no other hotel in the world where you can get such chicken livers and brochette. At dinner I asked a Negro waiter if there was anything doing in town. He pondered gravely for a minute, and then replied, "Well, boss, I don't really reckon there's anything at all doing after sundown." Sundown had been accomplished, it had been drowned in the drizzle long before. So that spectacle was denied me. But I went forth upon the streets in the drizzle to see what might be there. It is built on undulating grounds, and the streets are lighted by electricity at a cost of $32,470 per annum. As I left the hotel there was a race riot. Down upon me charged a company of freedmen, or Arabs, or Zulus, armed with, no, I saw with relief that they were not rifles, but whips. And I saw dimly a caravan of black, clumsy vehicles, and at the reassuring shouts, "Are you anywhere in the town, boss, foo 50 cents, I reasoned that I was merely a fare instead of a victim. I walked through long streets, all leading uphill. I wondered how those streets ever came down again. Perhaps they didn't until they were graded. On a few of the main streets I saw lights in stores here and there, saw streetcars go by conveying worthy burgers hither and yon, saw people pass engaged in the art of conversation, and heard a burst of semi-lively laughter issuing from a soda water and ice cream parlor. The streets other than Main seemed to have enticed upon their borders houses consecrated to peace and domesticity. In many of them lights shone behind discreetly drawn window shades, in a few pianos tinkled orderly and irreproachable music. There was, indeed, little doing. I wished I had come before sundown. So I returned to my hotel. In November 1864, the Confederate General Hood advanced against Nashville, where he shut up a national force under General Thomas. The latter then sallied forth and defeated the Confederates in a terrible conflict. All my life I have heard of, admired, and witnessed the fine marksmanship of the South in its peaceful conflicts in the tobacco-chewing regions. But in my hotel a surprise awaited me. There were 12 bright, new, imposing, capacious brass cuspidors in the great lobby, tall enough to be called urns and so wide-mouthed that the crack pitcher of a lady baseball team should have been able to throw a ball into one of them at 5 paces distant. But, although a terrible battle had raged and was still raging, the enemy had not suffered. Bright, new, imposing, capacious, untouched, they stood. But, shades of Jefferson brick. The tile floor, the beautiful tile floor. I could not avoid thinking of the Battle of Nashville, and trying to draw, as is my foolish habit, some deductions about hereditary marksmanship. Here I first saw Major, by misplaced courtesy, Wentworth Caswell. I knew him for a type the moment my eyes suffered from the sight of him. A rat has no geographical habitat. My old friend, A. Tennyson, said, as he so well said almost everything. Prophet, curse me the blabbing lip. And curse me the British vermin, the rat. Let us regard the word British as interchangeable ad lib. A rat is a rat. This man was hunting about the hotel lobby like a starved dog that had forgotten where he had buried a bone. He had a face of great acreage, red, pulpy, and with a kind of sleepy massiveness like that of Buddha. He possessed one single virtue, he was very smoothly shaven. The mark of the beast is not indelible upon a man until he goes about with a stubble. I think that if he had not used his razor that day I would have repulsed his advances, and the criminal calendar of the world would have been spared the addition of one murder. I happened to be standing within 5 feet of the cuspidor when Major Caswell opened fire upon it. I had been observant enough to perceive that the attacking force was using Gatlings instead of squirrel rifles, so I sidestepped so promptly that the Major seized the opportunity to apologize to a non-combatant. He had the blabbing lip. In 4 minutes he had become my friend and had dragged me to the bar. I desire to interpolate here that I am a Southerner. But I am not one by profession or trade. I eschew the string tie, the slouch hat, the Prince Albert, the number of bales of cotton destroyed by Sherman, and plug chewing. When the orchestra plays Dixie I do not cheer. I slide a little lower on the leather-cornered seat and, well, order another Würzburger and wish that Longstreet had, but what's the use? Major Caswell banged the bar with his fist, and the first gun at Fort Sumter echoed. When he fired the last one at Appomattox I began to hope. But then he began on family trees, and demonstrated that Adam was only a third cousin of a collateral branch of the Caswell family. Genealogy disposed of, he took up, to my distaste, his private family matters. He spoke of his wife, traced her descent back to Eve, and profanely denied any possible rumor that she may have had relations in the land of Nod. By this time I was beginning to suspect that he was trying to obscure by noise the fact that he had ordered the drinks, on the chance that I would be bewildered into paying for them. But when they were down he crashed a silver dollar loudly upon the bar. Then, of course, another serving was obligatory. And when I had paid for that I took leave of him brusquely, for I wanted no more of him. But before I had obtained my release he had prated loudly of an income that his wife received, and showed a handful of silver money. When I got my key at the desk the clerk said to me courteously, if that man Caswell has annoyed you, and if you would like to make a complaint, we will have him ejected. He is a nuisance, a loafer, and without any known means of support, although he seems to have some money most the time. But we don't seem to be able to hit upon any means of throwing him out legally. Why, no, said I, after some reflection, I don't see my way clear to making a complaint. But I would like to place myself on record as asserting that I do not care for his company. Your town, I continued, seems to be a quiet one. What manner of entertainment, adventure, or excitement have you to offer to the stranger within your gates? Well, sir, said the clerk, there will be a show here next Thursday. It is, I'll look it up and have the announcement sent up to your room with the ice water. Good night. After I went up to my room I looked out the window. It was only about 10 o'clock, but I looked upon a silent town. The drizzle continued, spangled with dim lights, as far apart as currants in a cake sold at the Ladies' Exchange. A quiet place, I said to myself, as my first shoe struck the ceiling of the occupant of the room beneath mine. Nothing of the life here that gives color and variety to the cities in the East and West. Just a good, ordinary, humdrum, business town. Nashville occupies a foremost place among the manufacturing centers of the country. It is the fifth boot and shoe market in the United States, the largest candy and cracker manufacturing city in the South, and does an enormous wholesale dry goods, grocery, and drug business. I must tell you how I came to be in Nashville, and I assure you the digression brings as much tedium to me as it does to you. I was traveling elsewhere on my own business. But I had a commission from a northern literary magazine to stop over there and establish a personal connection between the publication and one of its contributors, Azalea Adair. Adair, there was no clue to the personality except the handwriting, had sent in some essays, lost art, and poems that had made the editors swear approvingly over their 1 o'clock luncheon. So they had commissioned me to round up said Adair and corner by contract his or her output at 2 cents a word before some other publisher offered her 10 or 20. At 9 o'clock the next morning, after my chicken liver zen brochette, try them if you can find that hotel, I strayed out into the drizzle, which was still on for an unlimited run. At the first corner I came upon Uncle Caesar. He was a stalwart Negro, older than the pyramids, with grey wool and a face that reminded me of Brutus, and a second afterwards of the late King Setiwaio. He wore the most remarkable coat that I ever had seen or expect to see. It reached to his ankles and had once been a Confederate grey in colors. But rain and sun and age had so variegated it that Joseph's coat, beside it, would have faded to a pale monochrome. I must linger with that coat, for it has to do with the story that is so long in coming, because you can hardly expect anything to happen in Nashville. Once it must have been the military coat of an officer. The cape of it had vanished, but all adown its front it had been frogged and tasseled magnificently. But now the frogs and tassels were gone. In their stead had been patiently stitched, I surmised by some surviving black mammy, new frogs made of cunningly twisted common hemp and twine. This twine was frayed and dishevelled. It must have been added to the coat as a substitute for vanished splendors, with tasteless but painstaking devotion, for it followed faithfully the curves of the long missing frogs. And, to complete the comedy and pathos of the garment, all its buttons were gone save one. The second button from the top alone remained. The coat was fastened by other twine strings tied through the buttonholes and other holes rudely pierced in the opposite side. There was never such a weird garment so fantastically bedecked and of so many mottled hues. The lone button was the size of a $50, made of yellow horn and sewed on with coursed wine. This Negro stood by a carriage so old that Ham himself might have started a hack line with it after he left the ark with the 2 animals hitched to it. As I approached he threw open the door, drew out a feather duster, waved it without using it, and said in deep, rumbling tones, "Step right in, Sue, ain't a speck of dust in it, you got back from a funeral, Sue." I inferred that on such gala occasions carriages were given an extra cleaning. I looked up and down the street and perceived that there was little choice among the vehicles for hire that lined the curb. I looked in my memorandum book for the address of Azalea Adair. "I want to go to 861 Jessamine Street," I said, and was about to step into the hack. But for an instant the thick, long, gorilla-like arm of the old Negro barred me. On his massive and saturnine face a look of sudden suspicion and enmity flashed for a moment. Then, with quickly returning conviction, he asked blandishingly, "What are you gwine there for, boss?" "What is it to you?" I asked, a little sharply. "Nothing, Sue, nothing. Only it's a lonesome kind of part of town and few folks ever has business out there. Step right in. The seats is clean, Jess got back from a funeral, Sue. 1.5 miles it must have been to our journey's end." I could hear nothing but the fearful rattle of the ancient hack over the uneven brick paving. I could smell nothing but the drizzle, now further flavored with coal smoke and something like a mixture of tar and oleander blossoms. All I could see through the streaming windows were 2 rows of dim houses. The city has an area of 10 square miles, 181 miles of streets, of which 137 miles are paved, a system of waterworks that cost $2 million, with 77 miles of mains. 861 Jessamine Street was a decayed mansion. 30 yards back from the street it stood, outmerged in a splendid grove of trees and untrimmed shrubbery. A row of box bushes overflowed and almost hid the paling fence from sight. The gate was kept closed by a rope noose that encircled the gatepost and the first paling of the gate. But when you got inside you saw that 861 was a shell, a shadow, a ghost of former grandeur and excellence. But in the story, I have not yet got inside. When the hack had ceased from rattling and the weary quadrupeds came to a rest, I handed my Jehu his 50 cents with an additional quarter, feeling a glow of conscious generosity, as I did so. He refused it. "It's $2, Sue," he said. "How's that?" I asked. "I plainly heard you call out at the hotel, 50 cents to any part of the town." "It's $2, Sue," he repeated obstinately. "It's a long ways from the hotel." "It is within the city limits and well within them," I argued. "Don't think that you have picked up a greenhorn Yankee. Do you see those hills over there?" I went on, pointing toward the east. I could not see them, myself, for the drizzle. "Well, I was born and raised on their other side. You old fool nigger, can't you tell people from other people when you see 'em?" The grim face of King Setiwayo softened. "Is you from the south, Sue? I reckon it was them shoes of yourn fooled me. They is something sharp in the toes for a southern gentleman to wear." "Then the charge is 50 cents, I suppose?" said I inexorably. His former expression, a mingling of cupidity and hostility, returned, remained 10 seconds, and vanished. "Boss," he said, 50 cents is right, but I needs $2, Sue. I'm obliged to have $2. I ain't demanding it now, Sue, after I know where you's from. I'm sure saying that I has to have $2 tonight, and business is mighty po." Peace and confidence settled upon his heavy features. He had been luckier than he had hoped. Instead of having picked up a greenhorn, ignorant of rates, he had come upon an inheritance. "You confounded old rascal," I said, reaching down to my pocket, "you ought to be turned over to the police." For the first time I saw him smile. He knew. I gave him 2 $1 bills. As I handed them over I noticed that one of them had seen parlous times. Its upper right-hand corner was missing, and it had been torn through the middle, but joined again. A strip of blue tissue paper, pasted over the split, preserved its negotiability. Enough of the African bandit for the present. I left him happy, lifted the rope and opened a creaky gate. The house, as I said, was a shell. A paintbrush had not touched it in 20 years. I could not see why a strong wind should not have bowled it over like a house of cards until I looked again at the trees that hugged it close, the trees that saw the Battle of Nashville and still drew their protecting branches around it against storm and enemy and cold. Azalea Adair, 50 years old, white-haired, a descendant of the Cavaliers, as thin and frail as the house she lived in, robed in the cheapest and cleanest dress I ever saw, with an air as simple as a queen's, received me. The reception room seemed a mile square. because there was nothing in it except some rows of books, on unpainted white pine bookshelves, a cracked marble top table, a rag rug, a hairless horsehair sofa and 2 or 3 chairs. Yes, there was a picture on the wall, a colored crayon drawing of a cluster of pansies. I looked around for the portrait of Andrew Jackson and the pine cone hanging basket, but they were not there. Azalea Adair and I had conversation, a little of which will be repeated to you. She was a product of the Old South, gently nurtured in the sheltered life. Her learning was not broad, but was deep and of splendid originality in its somewhat narrow scope. She had been educated at home, and her knowledge of the world was derived from inference and by inspiration. Of such is the precious, small group of essayists made. While she talked to me I kept brushing my fingers, trying, unconsciously, to rid them guiltily of the absent dust from the half-calf backs of Lamb, Chaucer, Hazlitt, Marcus Aurelius, Montaigne, and Hood. She was exquisite, she was a valuable discovery. Nearly everybody nowadays knows too much, oh, so much too much, of real life. I could perceive clearly that Azalea Adair was very poor. A house and a dress she had, not much else, I fancied. So, divided between my duty to the magazine and my loyalty to the poets and essayists who fought Thomas in the valley of the Cumberland, I listened to her voice, which was like a harpsichord's, and found that I could not speak of contracts. In the presence of the 9 Muses and the 3 Graces one hesitated to lower the topic to 2 cents. There would have to be another colloquy after I had regained my commercialism. But I spoke of my mission. And 3 o'clock of the next afternoon was set for the discussion of the business proposition. Your town, I said, as I began to make ready to depart, which is the time for smooth generalities, seems to be a quiet, sedate place. A hometown, I should say, where few things out of the ordinary ever happen. It carries on an extensive trade in stoves and hollow ware with the West and South. And its flouring mills have a daily capacity of more than 2,000 barrels. Azalea Adair seemed to reflect. I have never thought of it that way, she said, with a kind of sincere intensity that seemed to belong to her. Isn't it in the still, quiet places that things do happen? I fancy that when God began to create the earth on the first Monday morning one could have leaned out one's window and heard the drops of mud splashing from his trowel as he built up the everlasting hills. What did the noisiest project in the world, I mean the building of the Tower of Babel, result in finally? A page and a half of Esperanto in the North American Review. Of course, said I platitudinously, human nature is the same everywhere, but there is more color, more drama and movement and, romance in some cities than in others. On the surface, said Azalea Adair, I have traveled many times around the world in a golden airship wafted on 2 wings, print and dreams. I have seen, on one of my imaginary tours, the Sultan of Turkey bowstring with his own hands one of his wives who had uncovered her face in public. I have seen a man in Nashville tear up his theater tickets because his wife was going out with her face covered with rice powder. In San Francisco's Chinatown I saw the slave girl sing Ye dipped slowly, inch by inch, in boiling almond oil to make her swear she would never see her American lover again. She gave in when the boiling oil had reached 3 inches above her knee. At a euchre party in East Nashville the other night I saw Kitty Morgan cut dead by 7 of her schoolmates and lifelong friends because she had married a house painter. The boiling oil was sizzling as high as her heart, but I wish you could have seen the fine little smile that she carried from table to table. Oh, yes, it is a humdrum town. Just a few miles of red brick houses and mud and lumber yards. Someone knocked hollowly at the back of the house. Azalea Adair breathed a soft apology and went to investigate the sound. She came back in 3 minutes with brightened eyes, a faint flush on her cheeks, and 10 years lifted from her shoulders. You must have a cup of tea before you go, she said, and a sugar cake. She reached and shook a little iron bell. In shuffled a small Negro girl about 12, barefoot, not very tidy, glowering at me with thumb in mouth and bulging eyes. Azalea Adair opened a tiny, worn purse and drew out a dollar bill with the upper right-hand corner missing, torn in two pieces, and pasted together again with a strip of blue tissue paper. It was one of the bills I had given the piratical Negro, there was no doubt about it. "Go up to Mr. Baker's store on the corner, Impy," she said, handing the girl the dollar bill, "and get a quarter of a pound of tea, the kind he always sends me, and 10 cents worth of sugar cakes. Now, hurry. The supply of tea in the house happens to be exhausted," she explained to me. Impy left by the back way. Before the scrape of her heart, bare feet had died away on the back porch. A wild shriek, I was sure it was hers, filled the hollow house. Then the deep, gruff tones of an angry man's voice mingled with the girl's further squeals and unintelligible words. Azalea Adair rose without surprise or emotion and disappeared. For 2 minutes I heard the hoarse rumble of the man's voice, then something like an oath and a slight scuffle, and she returned calmly to her chair. "This is a roomy house," she said, "and I have a tenant for part of it. I am sorry to have to rescind my invitation to tea. It was impossible to get the kind I always use at the store. Perhaps tomorrow, Mr. Baker will be able to supply me." I was sure that Impy had not had time to leave the house. I inquired concerning streetcar lines and took my leave. After I was well on my way I remembered that I had not learned Azalea Adair's name. But tomorrow would do. That same day I started in on the course of iniquity that this uneventful city forced upon me. I was in the town only 2 days, but in that time I managed to lie shamelessly by telegraph, and to be an accomplice, after the fact, if that is the correct legal term, to a murder. As I rounded the corner nearest my hotel, the effreet coachman of the polychromatic, nonpareil coat seized me, swung open the dungeony door of his peripatetic sarcophagus, flirted his feather duster and began his ritual, "Step right in, boss. Carriage is clean, you got back from a funeral. 50 cents to any." And then he knew me and grinned broadly. "'Scuse me, boss, you is the gentleman what rid out with me this morning. Thank you kindly, Sue. I am going out to 861 again tomorrow afternoon at 3, said I, and if you will be here, I'll let you drive me. So you know Miss Adair?" I concluded, thinking of my dollar bill. "I belonged to her father, Judge Adair, Sue," he replied. "I judge that she is pretty poor," I said. "She hasn't much money to speak of, has she?" For an instant I looked again at the fierce countenance of King Setiwayo, and then he changed back to an extortionate old Negro hack driver. "She ain't going to starve, Sue," he said slowly. "She has resources, Sue, she has resources." "I shall pay you 50 cents for the trip," said I. "That is perfectly correct, Sue," he answered humbly. "You had to have that $2 this morning, boss." I went to the hotel and lied by electricity. I wired the magazine, "Ada holds out for 8 cents a word." The answer that came back was, "Give it to her quick, you duffer." Just before dinner Major Wentworth Caswell bore down upon me with the greetings of a long-lost friend. I have seen few men whom I have so instantaneously hated, and of whom it was so difficult to be rid. I was standing at the bar when he invaded me, therefore I could not wave the white ribbon in his face. I would have paid gladly for the drinks, hoping, thereby, to escape another, but he was one of those despicable, roaring, advertising bibbers who must have brass bands and fireworks attend upon every cent that they waste in their follies. With an air of producing millions he drew 2 $1 bills from a pocket and dashed one of them upon the bar. I looked once more at the dollar bill with the upper right-hand corner missing, torn through the middle, and patched with a strip of blue tissue paper. It was my dollar bill again. It could have been no other. I went up to my room. The drizzle and the monotony of a dreary, eventless southern town had made me tired and listless. I remember that just before I went to bed I mentally disposed of the mysterious dollar bill, which might have formed the clue to a tremendously fine detective story of San Francisco, by saying to myself sleepily, "Seems as if a lot of people here own stock in the hack drivers trust. Pays dividends promptly, too. Wonder if." Then I fell asleep. King Setiwayo was at his post the next day, and rattled my bones over the stones out to 861. He was to wait and rattle me back again when I was ready. Azalea Adair looked paler and cleaner and frailer than she had looked on the day before. After she had signed the contract at 8 cents per word, she grew still paler and began to slip out of her chair. Without much trouble I managed to get her up on the antediluvian horsehair sofa, and then I ran out to the sidewalk and yelled to the coffee-colored pirate to bring a doctor. With a wisdom that I had not expected in him, he abandoned his team and struck off up the street afoot, realizing the value of speed. In 10 minutes he returned with a grave, gray-haired and capable man of medicine. In a few words, worth much less than 8 cents each, I explained to him my presence in the hollow house of mystery. He bowed with stately understanding, and turned to the old Negro. "Uncle Caesar," he said calmly, "run up to my house and ask Miss Lucy to give you a cream pitcher full of fresh milk and half a tumbler of port wine. And hurry back. Don't drive, run. I want you to get back sometime this week." It occurred to me that Dr. Merriman also felt a distrust as to the speeding powers of the land pirates' steeds. After Uncle Caesar was gone, lumberingly, but swiftly, up the street, the doctor looked me over with great politeness and as much careful calculation until he had decided that I might do. "It is only a case of insufficient nutrition," he said. "In other words, the result of poverty, pride, and starvation. Mrs. Caswell has many devoted friends who would be glad to aid her, but she will accept nothing except from that old Negro, Uncle Caesar, who was once owned by her family." "Mrs. Caswell?" said I, in surprise. And then I looked at the contract and saw that she had signed it as Azalea Adair Caswell. "I thought she was Miss Adair," I said. "Married to a drunken, worthless loafer, sir," said the doctor. "It is said that he robs her even of the small sums that her old servant contributes toward her support." When the milk and wine had been brought, the doctor soon revived Azalea Adair. She sat up and talked of the beauty of the autumn leaves that were then in season, and their height of color. She referred lightly to her fainting seizure as the outcome of an old palpitation of the heart. Impey fanned her as she lay on the sofa. The doctor was due elsewhere, and I followed him to the door. I told him that it was within my power and intentions to make a reasonable advance of money to Azalea Adair on future contributions to the magazine, and he seemed pleased. "By the way," he said, "perhaps you would like to know that you have had royalty for a coachman. Old Caesar's grandfather was a king in Congo. Caesar himself has royal ways, as you may have observed." As the doctor was moving off, I heard Uncle Caesar's voice inside. "Did he get both of them $2 from you, Miss Azalea?" "Yes, Caesar," I heard Azalea Adair answer weakly. And then I went in and concluded business negotiations with our contributor. I assumed the responsibility of advancing $50, putting it as a necessary formality in binding our bargain. And then Uncle Caesar drove me back to the hotel. Here ends all of the story as far as I can testify as a witness. The rest must be only bare statements of facts. At about 6 o'clock I went out for a stroll. Uncle Caesar was at his corner. He threw open the door of his carriage, flourished his duster and began his depressing formula, "Step right in, Sue. 50 cents to anywhere in the city, hacks perfectly clean, Sue, you got back from a funeral." And then he recognized me. I think his eyesight was getting bad. His coat had taken on a few more faded shades of color, the twine strings were more frayed and ragged, the last remaining button, the button of yellow horn, was gone. A motley descendant of kings was Uncle Caesar. About 2 hours later I saw an excited crowd besieging the front of a drug store. In a desert where nothing happens, this was manna, so I wedged my way inside. On an extemporized couch of empty boxes and chairs was stretched the mortal corporeality of Major Wentworth Caswell. A doctor was testing him for the immortal ingredient. His decision was that it was conspicuous by its absence. The erstwhile Major had been found dead on a dark street and brought by curious and inuied citizens to the drugstore. The late human being had been engaged in terrific battle, the details showed that. Loafer and reprobate though he had been also a warrior. But he had lost. His hands were yet clenched so tightly that his fingers would not be opened. The gentle citizens who had known him stood about and searched their vocabularies to find some good words, if it were possible, to speak of him. One kind-looking man said, after much thought, when Cass was about 14 he was one of the best spellers in school. While I stood there, the fingers of the right hand of the man that was which hung down the side of a white pine box, relaxed, and dropped something at my feet. I covered it with one foot quietly, and a little later on I picked it up and pocketed it. I reasoned that in his last struggle his hand must have seized that object unwittingly and held it in a death grip. At the hotel that night the main topic of conversation, with the possible exceptions of politics and prohibition, was the demise of Major Caswell. I heard one man say to a group of listeners, "In my opinion, gentlemen, Caswell was murdered by some of these no-account niggers for his money. He had $50 this afternoon which he showed to several gentlemen in the hotel. When he was found the money was not on his person. I left the city the next morning at 9, and as the train was crossing the bridge over the Cumberland River I took out of my pocket a yellow horn overcoat button the size of a 50-cent piece, with frayed ends of coarse twine hanging from it, and cast it out of the window into the slow, muddy waters below. I wonder what's doing in Buffalo." End of the story. Thank you.